these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, we're ready to go. Canyon Brimhall. That's quite the name.
Thank you, sir.
It does well with introductions. I like it.
Yeah.
Are you from Arizona?
Yes, sir. I'm like a sixth-generation Arizonan, born and raised, and now I'm out in D.C., so a very different place. A lot less dry and warm.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's about to snow here in a second. So your parents, was there some like Arizona connection to why they named you that?
Yeah. My family, my mom's side has a lot of Native American heritage. Mm-hmm. So while you can tell it was diluted quite drastically by the time it got to me, one of my great-grandparents really wanted to help kind of carry on that family legacy, right, of Native American history and culture. And she basically asked my parents if she could name one of their children. And the name that she came up with was Canyon. And my parents, being from Arizona, my mom's pretty hippie, were like, yeah, that's great. That's very Arizona and has the Native American tie-in. And, but to the general world, it's just really, I'm from Arizona. My name is Canyon. It makes sense.
It does make sense. Fits quite well. That's a great introduction to Canyon Brimhall. And people would be wondering why that is. We usually don't even start the podcast that way, but we did this time, and I like it. So, but the true topic is not your first name. It is reforming Section 230, which you happen to be an expert on. So, Canyon Brimhall, you're a federal government affairs manager at R Street, which is a think tank. You work at technology and innovation and national security and cybersecurity teams to promote pragmatic free market policy solutions to complex technological issues. So, Canyon, thanks so much for being on.
Thank you for having me, sir. It's an honor.
So, let's just get right to it. What's the best place to even start the conversation? Maybe that's the first question, because I'm tempted to say, okay, first explain the initial purpose of Section 230, why it even exists in the first place, and then let's get into why people think either abolishing it or reforming it would fix a lot of the problems that we see with censorship on social media.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that kind of the first and foremost thing that we need to do with Section 230 is clarify exactly what it is that we're talking about, right? Because I think that there's a lot of misinformation that kind of gets thrown around, and we end up in a game of telephone where nobody's really quite sure what we're talking about. So starting off with kind of that historical context, before Section 230, in the budding days of the internet, there was a lot of litigation regarding content on the internet. I'm not going to spout off court cases for you. Unfortunately, I wish I could, but I'm not that good at remembering the names of all the defendants and litigants. But long story short, websites were sued for hosting content, especially if they ever took down some content but missed other content. An example could be if people are posting defamatory comments on my website, maybe I consider them Nazi propaganda or even Antifa propaganda, these kind of very extremist positions, or death threats, harassment, pornography, general harassment is another good category. And what happened is people started suing the hosters of this information to say, you hosted this information, you should be liable for it. So examples include America Online, MySpace, the earlier social media network that most people don't really talk about anymore, and a host of other services. America Online was one of the big targets because they were one of the predominant players in terms of providing internet service to people. And I don't know if you use AOL yourself, they had their own kind of sandboxed environment where they had a lot of information that they kind of provided to you.
It was kind of funny in hindsight. It was like its own. It was like simultaneously a website, but also an internet provider. as I recall it. Yeah.
Exactly. I won't spend too much time on this, but funnily, my mom actually spent several years paying AOL to continue letting her log on to that, web portal, even though she could access her email for free using Internet Explorer or some kind of, alternate platform. Because she liked AOL. She was used to it. She liked the format that they had, the way that they presented things. So she continued to pay for that. I was worth it to her for several years until I convinced her otherwise.
Yeah. We all had grandmas like that.
Yeah, exactly. So now she's on Gmail. So she's great. So that was kind of where things were in the early days of the internet. So Section 230, actually, Congress passed the Communications Decency Act, was originally an attempt by Congress to rein in a lot of indecent materials online. The problem that they saw was there wasn't enough ability for websites to moderate, because if they did, then they were getting sued. An example would be if you took down one Nazi comment but missed another one, you could be sued for the Nazi comment that you missed. You could also be sued for Antifa comments that you didn't take down, because now those are on your website. You've shown that you take down some things, but you didn't take down this. So you are now liable for this piece of content, even if it's completely different than what you have taken down in the past. You took something down, you're now liable for everything.
Right.
So Congress, wanting the internet to not be full of pornography and, all kinds of disgusting things on websites.
That turned out real well.
Yeah. Well, but see, I would argue that it has, because when you go to Twitter, how much pornography do you see?
Yeah.
I don't. I have never seen pornography on Twitter, especially not, hardcore graphic pornography like what you would expect to see on a pornographic website.
Right.
So yes, these things exist, but they are in appropriate places for people who pursue those things. Similarly, I won't dovetail us there. But anyway, so that history meant that Congress said, websites, we want you to take down more content. We want you to be able to take these things down. We are going to empower you using Section 230 and a whole host of other laws to do that. Most of the other laws in the Communications Decency Act were eventually found unconstitutional, usually on First Amendment grounds. Section 230 is one of the few sections that has kind of stood the test of time and has been litigated over and over again in order to enshrine that as a protection. One example that I'll give of, soon after in the 90s, after Section 230 was implemented, one example of attempts to silence conservative speech by suing the platform that hosts it was Blumenthal v. AOL. I said I wasn't going to quote court cases at you, and there I go. But Blumenthal v. AOL, no, not the congressman, they sued, saying that AOL was hosting Drudge, Matt Drudge, his reports. AOL was hosting the Drudge Report. And because of that, AOL was sued for defamation because the Drudge Report was deemed by the litigants to be defamatory. Thankfully, Section 230 existed at this point, and the courts were able to step in and say, this is exactly the type of thing that Section 230 was meant to stop. You are not able to sue America Online for defamation because Matt Drudge says something that might be defamatory towards you. So I think that's kind of I don't want to blab at you too long, but I think that's kind of a good place setting in terms of the history and how we got here.
Yeah, well, it's extremely important because I don't think people quite understand the complicated nature of it and the need to protect the internet from this sort of whimsical lawsuits that could happen for all sorts of reasons that even conservatives would disagree with. The goal for conservatives is pretty clear. Like we basically want internet companies to abide by the spirit of the First Amendment. Okay, and if not that, at least operate within a very clear-cut set of standards. There's a huge difference between AOL and Twitter. I would argue. It's one thing for you to host a website like AOL or even like a CNN website, and which the entire purpose of which is to publish content. Like they are publishing content. CNN is publishing content that they control, that they're liable for. AOL is putting services online that they control, that they are liable for. But as a side note, they also allow commentary under these things. So that's quite different than what Twitter is, which the entire purpose of Twitter, at least as they allege, is for commentary, right? It's a social media website, which didn't exist when Section 230 was written. So, I think many people would argue rightfully that these are two different things and they require two different sets of regulations. And so if our goal is conservative, because Democrats have a totally different goal. They actually want more censorship, and I'm not sure how to meet in the middle on that when your goal is entirely different than mine. And so that's a political problem that we don't necessarily need to discuss. But if conservatives had the Senate, the House, and the presidency, and we were trying to figure out how to thoughtfully regulate this so that our goal is met, which is the maximum amount of free speech, while also understanding there's some things that should be taken down, like maybe it's pornography, maybe it's human trafficking, right? Maybe it's things that are not protected under the First Amendment, like illegal things, incentivizing violence, things like that. So what's the right way to get there? Is there any of the current talking points and pieces of legislation really get us there?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that there's a number of attempts to get at Section 230, but I don't think that any of them succeed in solving the issues that you're outlining. In particular, I'd like to kind of dive a little bit more into what you're talking about, which is the desire to have social media companies adhere to the spirit of the First Amendment, right? I think that in theory, I think that's great, and I think that in practice, they attempt to create a space where people can communicate, share ideas, and those kind of things. And the core of Section 230, I think, is really strengthening to the First Amendment, which is all it really says is that a speaker shall not be held liable for someone else's speech. Mm-hmm. So the First Amendment also protects Twitter, Facebook, and these corporations and their right to free speech. So I'm a strong property rights advocate. So I have a really hard time with this kind of concept that because they have reached a certain size, all of a sudden these social media companies become kind of publicly owned businesses. We haven't, to my knowledge, used eminent domain to take over these companies. We haven't, nationalized Twitter or Facebook, which I think would be a terrible idea. So I don't understand how we can be simultaneously pro-property rights and say, you Twitter, you Facebook, we're going to restrict your property rights and your First Amendment rights on your platform. Obviously there's a difference in size and scale, but I think of this in terms of if I owned a restaurant and someone came in and started yelling racist things, would I have the right to kick that person out of my restaurant? Similarly, does Twitter have the right to kick somebody off of their platform if they do something that speech that they fundamentally disagree with? The other part of what you were mentioning that I really think is important to discuss and think about is the question of whether or not platforms should only be able to get rid of unconstitutional or illegal speech. So you mentioned, if they are held to the First Amendment, then something that if speech doesn't violate the First Amendment, then it should be left up. Correct? Mm-hmm. Is that a fair characterization? So I think a perfect example of why that doesn't work is pornography. Pornography is not illegal, but I, as a Twitter user, don't want to be flooded with pornography when I go onto the site. I think there's another great example of this, which is Parler, which I assume you're familiar with. They created their platform as an alternative to Twitter and Facebook, and they started off by saying, we will only remove illegal speech. We will not remove speech that is protected by the First Amendment. So what happened? Their platform was flooded with pornography and pictures of feces. Poop everywhere. Imagine if everything you posted on, a social media website was responded to with 1,000 pictures of poop. That would not be a good way to have a discourse.
Have you seen the comments under my Twitter posts?
And they might not be far from it, but at least they're not literal pictures of poop.
I could probably find some. It's not illegal. I don't think Twitter, especially, they have no interest in protecting conservatives either. So that's kind of the point. It's very horrible stuff. Let's not pretend that Twitter isn't some garbage heap of human expression, because it absolutely is, right? So and there is, and you can find those kind of pictures. You can find pornographic pictures on Twitter. It doesn't necessarily come across your feed because it depends on who you follow. But I have a feeling that if somebody I followed posted that, I don't think Twitter takes it down.
Well, but what I'm saying is different than what you're articulating there, which is this isn't somebody that you follow. This could be random people on the internet coming to your Twitter page and posting pictures of, pornographic pictures. They could be.
Is that how Parler works? I'm not on Parler yet. So.
That was essentially at first their stance was we will not remove constitutionally protected speech, but they have since learned from that mistake and have amended that policy, and they had to put out a clarification that basically said, well, of course we're not going to just leave up pictures of poop and pornography and things like that. Of course that's not what we meant when we said we will leave up all constitutionally protected speech, but that is what they meant. They just didn't understand the unintended consequences of saying we will not remove it as long as it is legal. There are a lot of legal things that we still want to be able to remove from the internet in order to make these platforms something that we want to use.
Yeah. Okay. So and I think we probably end up agreeing, because what I was saying earlier was like, right, you need to have some ability to take things down that are clearly wrong. If you want to go slightly beyond protected speech, fine, I get it, right? Pornography being an example, standard, maybe clear and transparent standards would be a good start. And by the way, I think if Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, if they had just set clear and definable standards from the get-go, nobody would really be arguing. If you said, look, you can't say these words. These are words that we just don't accept, right? And these are defamatory words. They're racist words. If you use that word, your post gets taken down. That's a very clear standard by which to meet. If you say something violent, if you're clearly inciting violence, we will take, well, of course, that's not protected anyway. But you get my point. But of course, the problem is their standards are loose and they've become unbelievably partisan, and nobody trusts them anymore. They have other ways of throttling. They have and I've seen this. I don't like to act paranoid about it, but I've seen it sometimes on my own page, where you're like, this is just not how this normally goes, right? There's clear difference in what's happening with this particular post. I've seen pages similar to mine as far as growth go, and all of a sudden they stopped. And I've seen Instagram influencers just stop growing all of a sudden. It didn't make any sense. We've been following the exact same growth rate for a year now. So there's very obvious things that happen, and that's harder to prove. Because you're not necessarily taking a post down or fact checking it, which is a little bit more obvious to people. And so again, it seems like you and I probably have the same goal here, and we're not sure how to get there. I, for one, have been very skeptical of the claims that just getting rid of Section 230 would fix all of this, and not lead to a bunch of other consequences. So maybe let's start there. Because that's in the news right now. The president wants to veto the NDAA because it doesn't have the removal of Section 230 in it. Again, I totally agree with him on the need to do something about this. I'm not sure removing Section 230 is the right answer, and I'm sure as hell don't think that adding it to the NDAA is the right answer. So, that's a different question. What happens if you remove Section 230 just in its entirety, just abolish it?
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's a perfect question. I think that we really go back to, in many ways, the internet before Section 230 that I was outlining earlier, which is platforms would be sued for the content that creators put onto their platforms. Platforms being a very broad range of services, websites that we communicate with, especially anybody who has a comment section or some ability for users to participate. It would essentially force internet companies into one of two options. One, moderate everything. Essentially create gatekeepers that will pre-approve all content before it's allowed on the internet. Getting into more similar to like a newspaper or news organization, the mainstream media, which would be, we are liable for everything we put on here. We're going to vet it. We're going to check it. We're going to, fact check it and decide. And we'll even say, we don't personally agree with this. We don't want to attach our name to this as our stance. So we're not going to allow that to go up onto our site. The other option would be a totally hands-off approach that does zero moderation.
Yeah.
Because as I mentioned earlier, taking down even one piece of content opens you up to litigation for all content on your website. So that's where you end up with a situation that, if I like to think of, in kind of concrete terms. I look at, websites, especially ones for like children. We absolutely want Section 230 protections for websites designed for children, because that's what allows them to take down these things. Again, going back to pornography, it's not illegal, but we definitely don't want children exposed to pornography. When I was a kid, I used a website called neopets.com. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's very tailored towards children. It's got fun games and message boards and those kind of things. Without Section 230, I imagine that website and what it would be like. If they chose not to moderate at all, then, which would be one of their best options, legally speaking, then that website could be flooded with pornography, child exploitation, materials. It could even something as, maybe relatively innocent as feces. I don't know that we want our children to be exposed to that type of an environment.
Or they just wouldn't have comment sections. I mean, because I guess the websites you're talking about are websites that allow some interaction by users.
Yeah, exactly. There's no real impact. If you don't allow any interaction from your users, if it's only a one-way stream from the website to the user, then Section 230, at least as far as I understand, doesn't really apply.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think that makes sense from a legal perspective. You're put in either one of two extreme boxes. You're either getting massive censorship because you don't ever want to be sued, or you're getting no censorship at all, which is kind of, conservatives would be somewhat okay with that, I think. But to your point on Parler, that's a good experiment that shows, it gets a little wild out there.
And those websites can still exist under a Section 230 world. You look at websites like Reddit, 4chan, 8chan. Reddit has really cleaned up a lot of its subreddits in more recent years, and 4chan essentially got shut down and became 8chan. The idea there being these are the free, anything goes type of situations where you can find a lot of racist, homophobic, defamatory. You'll probably find a lot of pictures of poop on those websites. You
always bring it back to the poop.
I really always bring it back to that. So I think that those types of websites still exist today, and they can exist. So we haven't foreclosed that avenue of speech. That just I don't want that to be all of the internet.
Okay, so I want to read what Section 230 actually says, and see, I would argue based on this reading that I think Twitter, for instance, is surpassing the intent of 230 to an extraordinary degree by limiting political speech, or even fact checking, frankly. And so because it says no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be held liable on account of any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or user considers to be, and here's the words that are important: obscene. These are all just synonyms: obscene, lewd. Yeah. I hate this word. Lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. Now, I think the intent of that is kind of obvious. I don't think that intent is met by fact-checking basically what is often an opinion, a subjective opinion in political speech, which is what's driving everybody crazy. What are your thoughts on that? And could we make that clearer in the law and fix this?
So I think that the way that was worded, and particularly including the otherwise objectionable standard, and the reason there are so many synonyms is because they wanted to be all-encompassing. Their goal was so that some small thing wouldn't kind of fall through the cracks because someone could say, "Oh, well, that's not really lewd; it's just filthy." They said no, any of that, none of that's allowed. And if we didn't think of a reason why it's not allowed, here's a standard that you can apply to that situation. I think that. It kind of help me understand a little bit better what exactly is the core of your question. Why are they?
The core of my question is could we reword that line there to be more narrow and say, like, look, I don't have a problem with the obscene, lewd, because for your example of poop, right? Filthy. I don't really have a problem with these, but the otherwise objectionable part does open up the door for quite a few more quite a few more examples of censorship.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of an otherwise objectionable issue that would not be covered by the other words were we to say get rid of that portion of the standard. My colleague Shoshana Weissman, who I believe was on the podcast actually with you before.
We had a long conversation on sloths.
Licensing. Yeah, yes, she loves sloths. She's really great. And so she has written about this issue of dating sites. Dating sites are dealing with romance scams. So one of the people will create fake profiles to catfish people to trick them into sending them money or various, activities, essentially enwrapping them in a web of manipulation and exploitation. That does not necessarily fall under the obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing metrics.
Yeah.
But it is otherwise objectionable, which is why we have that standard. And this is one of the things that Shoshana has emphasized. If we eliminate Section 230, dating websites would lose the ability to remove fake profiles because it doesn't meet any of those other criteria.
Right.
So it's important to have that otherwise objectionable as a catch-all, because here's the other big point that I would make on this. Getting rid of Section 230 would be a giveaway to trial lawyers.
Yeah.
Lawyers would absolutely love it if you made it so that they could sue more people. Surprise, right? I'm never surprised when Josh Hawley, for example, a former attorney general and obviously very much a legally minded person, says that he wants to be able to sue social media companies. That's kind of like a no duh kind of situation. A lawyer wants to sue people. Yeah, of course.
It's also worth noting that Joe Biden has called for eliminating 230, and given that the Democrats have a totally different intent in mind, which is more censorship. It gives me pause when we talk about, because we have totally different goals here. And I'm sorry, but two totally different goals cannot be met by the exact same action. Right? Just that's
completely agree. And
logically thinking here. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it always gets me in these hearings when, the Republicans and Democrats will say, look how bipartisan this issue is. We're all here, beating up on these tech CEOs. We all agree that we hate Facebook. We hate Twitter. We're so bipartisan.
No.
That's not what bipartisanship is.
We have two totally different goals.
Exactly. It's not agreeing to hate the same person or company. It's agreeing to solutions. The solutions are where you get to bipartisanship, and they couldn't be more divergent on that fact. Because exactly like you said, Republicans are pushing for more speech to be left up, less, social media interfering and deciding what to take down or tag or any of that kind of stuff. And Democrats want more of that. It's shocking to me to hear in these hearings, for example, Congresspeople will bring up specific instances of moderation, and they'll say, I disagree with this moderation decision. You should not have taken down this post. And the companies will say, I'm sorry, that's just based on our policies, et cetera, et cetera. Right afterwards, a Democratic member will stand up and say, I disagree. I think you should have taken down that post faster. And I'm really upset with you that it was up for even 72 hours. How dare you leave, defamatory information up for 72 hours? So, and I think that really gets to the core of my concern with the proposals for changing Section 230, is they all put the government in some kind of an arbiter place of deciding what is and is not acceptable speech and acceptable curation, censorship, all these various things. And that is exactly what the First Amendment is supposed to protect us from. It is supposed to protect us from having essentially a ministry of truth that will tell social media companies, thou must leave up this content and must take down this content. That is government compelled or forbidden speech. And that, especially with an incoming Democratic administration, I would think that conservatives and Republicans would realize that giving more power to the federal government to determine what speech is and is not acceptable online is not a good idea.
Okay, so I'm running out of options here. Well, here's the next question then. What would you change about Section 230 to modernize it? Because it wasn't written in the scope of social media.
I think that argument strikes me very much similar to when people say that the Constitution must be out of date because it wasn't written to assume all of the technologies of today.
Right. We can amend the Constitution with an overwhelming majority of signatories. So
Absolutely, but I don't think that its age is kind of inherently a limiting factor in it.
We'll erase. Well, okay. Well, let's put that aside. Forget about when it was written. But is it working right now? For again to meet our goals here.
Yes, I would say yes, because social media companies, websites more broadly, are not flooded with a torrent of litigation that causes them to shut down. And it's easy to get lost in this world of Facebook and Twitter and those kind of folks who, quite honestly, could probably handle at least some amount of that litigation. I worry much more about your mom and pop websites. Please share with me if you've heard differently, but in the regulatory environment we have right now with Section 230, I'm not hearing about mom and pop shop websites getting sued into oblivion for someone posting a comment or a review on their website. That is something that we don't have. And I think that the real thing that scares me about changing Section 230 is the flood, even the threat of litigation is enough to chill speech and to significantly change how businesses operate. Even if their lawsuits are frivolous, Section 230 in its current form prevents those lawsuits from being brought up in the first place. And that kind of protection, especially for small players on the internet, I think has given us exactly the internet ecosystem that we have today. We have all of the largest, most successful technology companies in the world, sans maybe Spotify in Europe. That's pretty much their main success story. That's because of Section 230. I don't know if you're familiar with Jeff Kosef. He wrote a book called The 26 Words That Created the Internet. You read earlier, the wording of Section 230. It's 26 words. It's really very simple, and I wish more people would read it. That is the foundation for the entire.
Do you have it? Do you have those 26 words in front of you? Can we read them?
I sure do. Yes, absolutely. So it's Section 230, subsection C1 is treatment of publisher or speaker. No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider.
Okay, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It does. But let's get back to intent. I'm going to read a quote from Andrew McCarthy. I think he puts this rather well. He said, quote, "Clearly, Congress was not of a mind to grant immunity from speaker-publisher liability to interactive computer services that suppressed content based on their subjective political objections to it. Such a grant would have contradicted Congress's aforementioned described objective to promote true diversity of political discourse," right? So, this gets to the goal that we have, right? And so you've pretty well established that you don't think changing Section 230 would really meet that goal because of all the unintended consequences that associate with that. Literally an hour ago, I just recorded a podcast with Brendan Carr, commissioner at the FCC, and he tends to agree. I mean, I think he's a little bit more on my side on maybe we can more narrowly focus Section 230, but he brought up something rather interesting, which might be a better solution, which is looking at consumer protection law, because the thing is that these companies, Twitter, Facebook, they created their monopoly on our internet discourse by basically claiming that this is where free speech happens, and this is where you can connect, this is where you can talk, and they got everybody in on that. Okay. Then as years went on, they started to change their minds, right? And they started to act especially as political actors. So, are they upholding, their initial sales pitch, right? Did they engage in false marketing to the consumer? Is that a better way to look at this?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'd be remiss to tell you whether or not that would be successful. From my understanding of it, it has been ruled by the courts that terms of service or those kinds of voluntary agreements that the company lays out for its users are not legally enforceable. So I don't know that it would be how successful you will be, in bringing those litigations. But I definitely think that is a proper, that the FTC, the pro-consumer welfare standard, that is the proper way to look at these types of situations, particularly when it comes to antitrust situations. I heard in there, they established their monopoly, and I know this isn't a discussion on antitrust, but I would push back a little bit on that and say, I think it itself is ironic, the sentence, Facebook and Twitter created their monopolies. That in of itself seems self-contradictory. Twitter is not a monopoly because Facebook exists, and vice versa. Also, Parler, Gab, any other number of social media networks. So I don't think that these are monopolies to begin with. And then the other part is that's like saying, suing a company because they have a mission statement saying we want to make the world a better place. We want to do these X, Y, and Z, and then suing them and saying you didn't fulfill your mission statement. I don't think that that's probably going to be very effective.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, let's narrow the question then. I agree that I'm not so sure litigation would be effective there, just based on current law. I think maybe the question is that where we focus our policy objectives? Is that where we focus future legislation? Basically narrowing how they can actually write out these extremely, because what they do is they have very vague standards. And I think we could argue that the enforcement of those standards, because they're so vague to begin with, are extremely arbitrary and extremely subjective, which in turn damages consumer protection rights. I mean, whether it's new policy or new legislation, is that the better avenue to, again, get to the goal that we want to get to, right? Force these companies to actually have coherent standards by which they operate, which in turn, you could argue is a consumer protection issue, because they have these standards and you have to sign on to them to create an account, but the methods by which they're enforcing them are unbelievably subjective and partisan. That's well known at this point, and it's obvious. Are they? You might argue that they're already violating consumer protection law, and if they're not, then should we be looking at policy or legislation that defines that better?
Yeah, so I think that when we get into these areas of talking about, kind of what they promised to people, and then how they've changed over time, I think that that's actually really indicative of exactly the problems that I see with putting government into this position. The reason that they, first of all, I would say Facebook was originally started not as some bastion of free speech on the internet. It was started by Mark Zuckerberg as a way for college students to hook up with each other. I think if we're being honest about the situation. So I don't think that, and even if at some point they had said, yes, we should have these lofty goals, that was never the true goal of them to begin with. What we have seen over time is actually political influence, political pressure has forced them to become more and more moderators and determinants of content. I look back to 2016, Donald Trump, the election, and how much complaining there was, especially from Democrats, about misinformation and Russian, manipulation of our election system with all of the speech that was proliferating on these platforms. As a result, in order to, Facebook and Twitter and all other social media platforms essentially have bent to political pressure to say, okay, we're going to moderate more. We're going to take down more content, more speech. And I have a really hard time imagining how we would craft a law that would not just further that exact treatment. If you've got Democratic senators, Democratic members of Congress, President Biden, who you mentioned, has come out against Section 230. If they're the ones writing the rules for what is an acceptable term of service, what level of transparency or neutrality do you have to meet in order to receive these Section 230 protections, I think we're going to end up in a worse place, not a better place. And just in general, I think that this strikes at the core of, as a defender of the First Amendment, first and foremost, these companies have a right to speech. So I don't know that it's appropriate for us to say, they can't have certain speech, or they must have certain speech, or their terms of service must be specifically, worded in these ways, or include this information. I think that that's a really slippery slope that really puts the government in control of, what speech is and is not acceptable on the platforms.
Okay, so you kind of shot down every single solution I've sort of offered here. So so the final question would be like, well, is there a solution? If we both agree that there's a problem and that we have a specific goal in mind that we agree on, and we're not meeting that goal, just which is basically protecting the spirit of the First Amendment, and more importantly, just stopping the arbitrary and subjective censorship of political speech, which arguably, and I think strongly arguably, I know that's not correct English, influences elections in major ways and has extreme consequences. So what is the solution?
Yeah, so I think, I am not going to say that there is no bias on social media platforms. I think it's obvious that there is. Their user bases skew liberal. There are more liberals on Twitter and Facebook in general than there are conservatives. Their employee bases skew liberal. They're located in the Silicon Valley. I think that just makes sense. And to the average person, that's intuitive, right? Of course, there's bias in these situations. Mm-hmm. My issue is I don't think that, putting that power in the government's hands would make it less biased. And I'm more interested in a world of competing biases because I don't believe that there is such a thing as a truly neutral arbiter of facts and information. I think a lot of things come down to subjectivity and opinion. So I'm much more interested in ensuring that there is a competitive marketplace where alternatives to Facebook and Twitter can exist, like Gab, like Parler. Going back to saying what happens if we get rid of Section 230, I don't think those websites exist. I think that those websites get destroyed under crushing litigation before they're able to get off the ground. But I think that Facebook and Twitter probably continue to exist because they're the large incumbent players who are able to, engage in regulatory capture. It's not a coincidence that Mark Zuckerberg says, "Oh yes, please regulate us. We would love it if all of these things we do voluntarily right now. We would love it if all of our competitors were forced to do those same exact things." Of course, they feel that way. That would benefit Facebook and harm their competitors. So I think that when we, and the other part, so there is obviously some amount of censorship online. But the other part that I want to emphasize is we have to be very careful, especially as conservatives, that we don't, kind of shoot ourselves in the foot and make something that is maybe not perfect even worse. I look back to Donald Trump's comments. He said, "Without the tweets, I wouldn't be here." Straight up, he said, Without tweets, without Twitter, he does not think he would be president. And many people have agreed with him that is a way for him to cut through the mainstream media, to cut through the gatekeepers and the people who would censor him and get his message directly to his followers. So I think that narrative, the fact that Donald Trump has used it successfully and used it to become president, counters the idea that the internet is just a wasteland for conservative thought, as if it's not useful for conservatives. If anything, I would caution people from, there's analogies made to, CNN or, newspapers, they're subjected to these regulations. Why aren't Facebook and Twitter? Well, how much conservative commentary do you get from those publications? Do you really want the mainstream media to also, and how they operate, to also be how Facebook and social media companies operate? So I think that it's important for us to protect the opportunities for speech that we have, especially for conservative speech that would otherwise be censored. The social justice warriors would make sure that Donald Trump was not heard if we subjected these platforms to increased regulation. So I would actually say that the status quo that today with Section 230 is much better for conservatives than the alternative of a world without Section 230, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely see your points on many cases there, and I have to bring that up when I talk about it too. I say, the media itself is so unbelievably biased. I mean, God, we deal with it every day. Their ability to create narratives by writing objectionable stories and then using that as a sort of I say persuasion by listing. Of like, look at this, this, and this, and there's only a tiny bit of kernel of truth to each of those, but taken in an aggregate, it seems to be true. They're very good at spinning narratives in that way. The only way for somebody like me to fight back is through my social media accounts, right? So
Exactly.
and that is absolutely true. Even though, but they're trying to infiltrate that as well, right? Because I guess the left understands that our only way as conservatives to get our voices heard is on these platforms, and they're trying to chip away at that, and that only seems to be going in one direction. And so, I kind of have to keep asking the question. We have to stop that direction. We have to stop that flow before we're completely censored out of existence. Like, again, the mainstream media has already done its job by allowing the left to completely control that institution. And even though we have our own conservative media, well, as we've seen with, say, the New York Post story on Hunter Biden, social media companies will disallow them to even promote their protected First Amendment right as a freedom of the press. So, I mean, it's going in a bad direction. And the only entity powerful enough to stop it is the government itself. I mean, I would love to believe that competition is the answer, but Parler is really just a place for conservatives to talk to each other at this point. It's not reaching your average citizen, whereas Twitter and Facebook do. I mean, they do have a strangle. And I understand that, yes, there's two of them, and in theory, that's a competition. But in all practical reality, it is not. It is a monopoly from Silicon Valley and a select group of people that work there that all think exactly the same. So, this is why conservatives are so hungry for some kind of solution, because I think the idealism of the libertarian stance on this, which is that competition solves everything, isn't necessarily working in this case. And we're hungry for solution. I mean, you even said it's not perfect. So I guess the question is there a way to make that regulation perfect? I mean, and I'm not so sure it means government is regulating that speech. I think it means a law that is written, whether it's along the consumer protection angle or whether it's along the Section 230 angle, that just more narrowly defines what you can take down. I mean, could it be as simple as saying subjective political speech is not part of this protection? Right? You can't do that because of the overreaching consequences of that. Again, the fundamental question of what government I mean, the government already Section 230 already makes, again, it uses words like obscene, lewd, filthy, excessively violent. So it's already doing it. So what is the problem with adding a few more words to that sentence to more narrowly define or exclude what they can do, in order to protect the spirit of the First Amendment?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, that's my answer is protecting the spirit of the First Amendment also means protecting the rights of those individuals to, take down speech that they don't want on their platform. Yet we get into this tricky situation where, I don't really fully understand exactly where conservatives who are generally, pro property rights start to think, okay, but you're too big. And again, I would push back on the kind of monopoly idea, because I don't believe that's accurate. And looking back, once upon a time, Facebook was supposedly a monopoly, or sorry, not Facebook, MySpace was supposedly a monopoly. And it still exists. MySpace is still a thing. You could go and make an account right now. You might even still have one if you used it back in the day. But they are not a player in the scheme of things. This idea that Facebook is a monopoly is really kind of surprising to me and seems very short-sighted, because I barely use Facebook. Many of the people in my generation I know don't. And one of its biggest competitors, if not its biggest, is probably TikTok, which is a rising star and is not Twitter, a common competitor. Google, right? Google is commonly touted as a monopoly or a giant company with outsized power and the ability to dominate markets. Well, okay, what happened to Google Plus, the social network that Google started? It failed because people didn't like it. So I think that while it seems in this this moment right now, it seems hard to imagine a world where Facebook and Twitter aren't the dominant players. I think that in some ways that's a failure of imagination, because if we look to the future, there will almost inevitably be new services, new platforms that will come and will challenge them. Even the acquisition of Instagram was itself Facebook attempting to innovate ahead of the curve in order to stay in business. And they may not be as relevant today as they are if they hadn't done that, because Instagram was a budding competitor. So I think that first and foremost, I would kind of challenge those ideas that there is this kind of market dominance or that it is inevitable that these are the players. And then I would be very skeptical of having the government detail exactly what you can and cannot take down. I think that leaving it up to because everything is subjective, they're so hard to find objectively, this is wrong, this is bad. You're always going to have someone subjective making these decisions. And I would rather have those subjective decisions be made in the companies than I would in the government. And especially when the government is largely controlled by liberals who are calling for increased censorship of speech. That really scares me.
Yeah, but I kind of feel like we're talking past each other, because I also do not want regulators in the administration, any administration, saying, "Now this was right, this was wrong," et cetera, et cetera. Because that's just somebody else giving a subjective opinion. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to maybe force into law that you have to have better standards by which you operate, right? Because of consumer protection rights. You can't ask people to sign up for something based on this set of standards and then just run willy-nilly with these standards, which are so vague and so impossible to predict, really. Because it's impossible to predict what will be taken down, what will be fact-checked based on those standards. So by simple consumer protection measures, you could argue the best way to do this is to have clearer standards in place by which we can all operate that allow for no subjectivity, right? Again, none of this would be happening if these companies would just say, "Look, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. You can't say these words. You can't post the pictures of poop. You can't do this exactly, right?" And then you wouldn't have all this space for this nonsense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I see where you're coming from with that. I think that the issue that we get into with is, how do you what are the words, that you want to ban? I think this kind of gets back into the Carlin.
Well, they can decide. They can decide. Twitter can decide what words you can't say, right? If they want to say you can't say the word Republican, all right. Well, at least that's clear. But the problem is that they don't do that. The problem, and again, this is why I tend to agree with Brendan Carr's analysis on this, and he's a lawyer on this, so that's why we had that conversation. It was a pretty persuasive argument he makes that maybe that's the better avenue, because now it's about what you're really signing up for. Here are the standards, and now government really has no control beyond that. Because you as long as the standards are clear, the government, litigation would be, you could still sue them and say you are not operating on clear standards, and you have to clarify your standards. So I think it's the best of both worlds, because it allows the more libertarian stance to say, well, Twitter, you can still be that liberal platform, but now you're going to have to explicitly say that you're a liberal platform.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that so far what we've discussed has been pretty much entirely, government action and those kind of things. I will agree with you in the sense that these companies can do better, and I wish that they would. I think that transparency is a big portion of that. And you mentioned towards the beginning of our discussion that we probably wouldn't even be having a lot of these issues. We wouldn't have these discussions to begin with if Twitter and Facebook provided clear and transparent terms of service that very articulately said, here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed, here's these specific phrases or terms or types of images, these things are banned, these things are allowed. I think that would be a good thing for these companies to do, because I think it would be good for their business. I think that it would endear them to their users. So from a purely business perspective, wanting to provide the best experience to your users, I think that you should provide transparency. I also don't always agree with, individual moderation decisions. And it would be really nice. And sometimes I see ones where I'm like, dang, why is that up? And this other thing was taken down.
Yeah,
and
it's very inconsistent.
Exactly, and I think that also has a lot to do with the mechanism by which they do takedowns, which is a notice and takedown regime. They have millions or billions of pieces of content that get posted on their website on a regular basis, and the way that they decide what to even scrutinize, let alone take down, is usually based on user reports. So a user says, I don't like that, they flag it, and then that gets put into either an algorithm or into a manual curation system. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's obvious to everyone that the employee bases as well as the user bases for these companies skew liberal. So of course you're going to end up with more conservative content taken down if the entire regime is, okay, we've got a bunch of liberals on our platform and they're going to, I've also heard anecdotal evidence that liberals are more likely to flag content as inappropriate, whereas conservatives are more likely to say, I don't agree with it, but I'm not going to flag it. And just based on how the platforms work, that's going to result in more censorship of conservatives. So I wish, in a free market perspective, that Twitter and Facebook would voluntarily adopt more transparency metrics, because I think that is how they will stay relevant going into the future, and one of the ways that they won't get overtaken by a competitor. Because I could see that as a point of competition in the market. If a social media company rises that says, we have very clear and transparent criteria for what we will and will not take down, that is a competitive advantage for that company with users who will say, this is exactly what we've been waiting for this whole time. No more arbitrary takedowns, none of this kind of stuff. That's exactly what we want. So that gets back to kind of my what I was saying as far as competition and new entrants challenging them. Or it might even be that a new entrant challenges them and then forces Facebook and Twitter to adopt more transparent rules, which I think would be a very good thing. My skepticism comes in when you say, like the federal government should mandate that they have transparent rules, or what, and what does, because then I have lots of questions. What does transparency mean? What can I make them as, and I as a corporation would say, okay, I'm going to try to make these as vague as possible if I'm being held to them legally, because I'm going to want to be able to wiggle out of things later on down the road. So I don't think that a government mandate would result in more clarity or more transparency. I think that it would result in less. I look at things like GDPR, right, in Europe. I'm sure you're familiar with that. The data regulation that basically, we are all now dealing with, because we get a pop-up on every website that says, do you accept cookies? I don't think that has made our information any more secure. It just means that now their companies have us check a box every time we go to a website so that they can get out of liability. So I think that you would end up in a similar situation where they would do something boilerplate in order to meet the technical requirements of the law that Congress passes. But I think that it would get further from the spirit of what you're going for, which is true transparency. And I think we get that through competition in the market.
I hope so. I mean, we might just have to agree to disagree on that, but it's because it has been a very good and thoughtful and fact-oriented conversation, because there's just so much confusion around, I mean, if you ask, a typical American right now, it really is just get rid of Section 230 and everything's fine. The reality is far more complicated than that. But we certainly have an interest in improving this, and to me, it certainly is about transparency and clarity of terms of use and standards by which they operate. And I'm not as hopeful as you are that competition will solve that. It just doesn't seem to be working. It seems to be getting worse. And even with Parler and everybody moving to Parler, I don't think Jack Dorsey cares. I just don't. And if he cares, his board members and his staff certainly don't care. And and again, I don't know what's inside the mind of Jack Dorsey. Maybe it's pressure from his employees that force them into this. I don't know. I don't really care. I just know that it's not working. And we've got to be very thoughtful about how we get to the objective that we want, which is protecting the First Amendment. And I don't think we foresaw that certain politically oriented companies would have so much control over the broader narrative that Americans absorb and that they listen to. You know, we're always worried about the government having too much control over what people heard and what they listened to, but there are entities that are arguably far more powerful than the government in this respect, and they're not acting in good faith, and so it's a difficult problem, as this conversation has noted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Canyon, anything else to add?
There's just one thing I was going to mention you were talking about the New York Post story, and I think that that's a really good example, both of a mistake on the part of the platforms that I think that Twitter probably should not have taken down that content in the way that it did, but it shows the difficulty of moderating, and content moderation, I would like to emphasize, is very difficult, especially when you have people in Congress on the opposite sides of the aisle telling you to do the exact opposite thing with a specific instance of content, where one member is telling you take it down and another is telling you leave it up. I think that they have done the best that they can in a very difficult situation, and they make mistakes. That's absolutely the case. But I would argue that the New York Post story actually illustrates the benefit of social media, because okay, they throttled it, they limited its exposure, but I still heard about it. You still heard about it. It's still on Twitter today. I can go on Twitter right now and find 1,000 copies of the New York Post story. In fact, sometimes when a story gets censored, it actually causes it to gain steam and get more attention. I would argue that New York Post story might have gotten more attention because it was censored by Twitter than if it had not been censored at all. It could have just quietly gone into the night, but censoring it really drew attention to it. And I would challenge people who think that reforming Section 230 or eliminating Section 230 will improve the situation. I would challenge them to look at the mainstream media. If the mainstream media had decided that New York Post story was obtained illegitimately, in this instance via hacked materials, do you think that we would be able to go onto the CNN website and find information about the New York Post story? No, they would have scrubbed it. They would have censored it. They would have made sure that there was no mention of it anywhere. So if anything, I think that is an illustration of consumer pressure against Twitter caused them to actually host speech that they had formerly censored. And that's a power that we only have in social media and not in any other form of media. So please, let's not make social media more like mainstream media, because I think there's a lot that we would lose.
Yeah, it's definitely a fair argument. All right, Canyon, thanks so much for being on. Thanks for the thoughtful discussion on this. I really appreciate it.
Congressman, likewise, I really appreciate your thoughtful questions. So much we can engage in rancor and talking past each other, but I think that you and I have really engaged in a thoughtful conversation. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was great, and I think educational as well. All right, appreciate you being on.